I'm making this video in response to reports that Christian Aid, UK and Ireland, an organisation that I love, that I used to work for, is considering closing down its offices in Latin America. This is a big deal, not just... Don't do that, smile. Go for go. No, give me that. This is a big deal, not just for the communities and NGOs that Christian Aid supports in this part of the world, but also because of what it symbolises, what it says about the direction of international civil society. So while I'm addressing this video to Christian Aid, I hope that the issues that it discusses are useful to the wider movement. Most people would describe Christian Aid as a charity, but I don't like that word. Charity implies handouts, a giver-receiver relationship. But the Christian Aid I know has always tried to undermine that relationship, turn it on its head. Building partnership, building solidarity. And that's a really important point because there's great pressure in the international development sector to focus limited resources only on the very poorest parts of the world. But if help isn't just about charity, handing over money, but about solidarity, standing with people in their struggles, then income levels and absolute poverty are only one factor to be considered, an important factor, but only one factor. One of the most important lessons I learned when I was running Christian Aid here in Colombia is that although the money is important, of course it is, more important, definitely far more important, is simply just being here. And I don't mean being here in Bogota, I mean being physically present with Afro-Colombian communities struggling to return to their land, marching alongside indigenous communities defending their way of life, in planning meetings with women's cooperatives seeking to exert their economic power, in advocacy meetings with embassies, governments, with companies trying to impose the importance of basic human rights, in strategy meetings with local civil society and NGOs. You hear people say, oh, but Colombia's a middle-income country, Bolivia, Brazil are middle-income countries, they've got money. And of course, you know, there is money here. But like in most countries in this region and in the world, it's not spreading. It's in the hands of the few. It's spirited out of the country. And the social conflict, which emanates from deep inequality, and in Colombia at least, expresses itself often in violence, doesn't appear to be going anywhere. It's hard to say. It could be deepening. I have great respect for the efforts of the previous administration here under Juan Manuel Santos in trying to push for peace with the guerrilla. But even in the best of scenarios, and we're far from that at the moment, the deep threat and risk and corruption at the heart of Colombian politics is going to stay around for decades. And in those decades, the victims will still be the marginalised communities, men, women and children, who are struggling to get on, yes in poverty, but with dignity. The marginalised communities with which Christian Aid has decided historically to take a stand, along with many other organisations, sometimes bravely, to take a stand. And those communities need Christian Aid today just as much as they always have, and they'll need Christian Aid tomorrow. The fight for control of resources, natural and otherwise, continues, and the role of international civil society standing by communities under threat is as important as ever. Put more positively, supporting gradual change whereby the people on the underside of history, in the words of the liberation theologians, day by day, year by year, claim and reclaim their autonomy and power. And if that's true in Colombia, it's also true across this unequal, unfair, sometimes violent region, and across the world. So what should international organisations like Christian Aid do in this undoubtedly difficult funding environment? What should drive strategy? Well, number one, have absolutely no regard whatsoever for the concept of middle-income countries. I've done quite a lot of work on this, and I can tell you that the denomination low-income or middle-income is entirely arbitrary. No one knows why the particular cut-off point exists. Some totally random equation back in the mists of time. But what we do know is that the cut-off point is incredibly stingy, describing countries like Guatemala, Bolivia, India, Indonesia, Zimbabwe, South Sudan, Senegal, as middle income, the list goes on, is incredibly damaging to efforts to try and raise international solidarity with marginalised communities in those countries. I've heard India described as wealthy in the UK Houses of Parliament. And it's all to reinforce this narrative that wealthy countries now need to no longer worry so much about their international responsibilities. In the words of a very influential economist, Paul Collier, there is basically no role for the international development community in middle-income countries. With great respect, that's total nonsense. I prefer the attitude of Martin Ravalian, who was a World Bank research director, who said, "Isn't it time we got rid of this archaic language of middle income and low income?" 47% of Guatemalans are malnourished, which means they're either thinner or shorter than they should be. And yet Guatemala is not only a middle income country, it's classified as an upper middle income country. And we're led to believe that there's no role for international development, cooperation in such countries. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't consider income levels in your strategies. Of course that's a relevant factor. I'm just saying don't overemphasize it and don't use this incredibly unhelpful terminology. Ignore the classifications of the OECD and the World Bank and do your own analysis of need. Second, and this is related, international development is not just about combating extreme poverty. In fact, it would be fairly grotesque if that's all it was about. As if when the very, very lowest level of living standard has been achieved, we can all wash our hands and walk away. Development only really starts when extreme poverty has been eradicated. While extreme poverty is always a top priority for anyone concerned about international development, there are many other issues that Christian Aid and others have worked on for decades and need to continue doing so. Most obviously, humanitarian emergencies don't occur always in the most poorest parts of the world, and they will continue to require immediate international solidarity. And by the same token, conflict and violence, human rights violations, displacement, repression are not particularly related to poverty, but much more so to inequality and unfairness and power. International cooperation can be crucial to support civil society in those contexts, and it's especially appropriate when the problems are related to international trade and the economy. For instance, the export of gas and oil, mining, bananas, palm oil, you name it. And I haven't even mentioned climate chaos yet. And the Amazon is just south of here. The ambition of international civil society needs to grow to respond to planetary and regional challenges. So while it's perfectly valid and important for some organisations to continue to focus on extreme poverty, it's equally valid and important to respond to other challenges that exist. And indeed it would be tragic if we didn't. And by the way, the definition of extreme poverty is just as arbitrary as the definition of low income and middle income countries. Someone somewhere randomly, they didn't say it was random but pretty much was, defined a poverty line. Third, it's not just about need, it's about the unique contribution your organisation can make. And again, this is a fairly obvious point to anyone who's ever written a strategy, but it's worth repeating. If all organisations just did a needs analysis, they'd all be working on the same issues in the same places. But of course, all organisations have their own specific and special characteristics. And there are many of those to look at, but I'd just like to mention one, and that's the history of an organisation in a particular geography. Christian Aid has been active in Colombia for, I would say, 4 or 5 decades. And that means relationships of trust have built up, which allows the organisation to do things that other organisations would find it difficult to do. It's very sad when that comes to an end, and it's very hard to build that up again. It takes decades. 4, don't just think about your direct contribution. You are facilitators, builders of a global movement. I think this is a factor that's often overlooked. Think of the loss to Christian Aid and its other global partners if Latin American ideas and perspectives on violence, economic inequality, climate change, civil society and movement building, all the things that Latin America has such powerful analysis of, is lost in Christian Aid strategy meetings and in its meetings with other organisations around the world. And think of the loss to Latin American organisations if international civil society continues to pull out and pulls away those bridges that allow a global movement to be built. This is about building networks, strengthening global alliances, organising resistance to damaging economic models and practices, not just projects and programmes of support. This struggle isn't going anywhere. Why are you? And fifth and finally, educate your funders, don't just follow them. I know finance is at the heart of all this. Clearly you have to respond somewhat to the instincts and stipulations of the people that fund you. But in the 21st century, international cooperation can be and will be very different to what we're used to from 20th century paradigms. A new narrative, new ambitions, but mostly INGOs are still stuck in that 20th century approach, and so are their funders. Whether they're massive funders like the Gates Foundation and DFID, or your small funders on the street, the people that put pennies in the collecting tins. To generalise, they're quite relaxed about emergencies, basic needs, and those kind of things, but when it comes to holding power to account, then money can be harder to come by. But that's exactly what Christian Aid is about. And it's what international civil society needs to focus on ever more. We need to be part of changing an outdated charity model, keeping hold of the most important stuff, the generosity, but moving towards something that's much more modern, a global movement for change. So that's it. I know it's incredibly easy for me to sit here and share these thoughts, and you're the ones with all the difficult, real funding priorities that you've got to balance. And I hope some of the things I've said will help, and I wish you the best of luck.